my first call to ministry, I was serving a church that had developed a practice of sharing faith stories. It was their answer to more evangelical practices of having an altar call where people would come forward and share their testimonies. We identified people within the congregation who simply wanted to come before the congregation and share something of their spiritual journey. One Sunday, there was a man named Rob who came forward to give one of these stories. He was a hotshot, self-described hotshot attorney, a professor from UC Berkeley, and he said that when he was young, all of his success and being looked up to had gotten to his head, and he spiraled down into addictions to drugs and alcohol and really was on the threshold of losing everything. And he discovered this church. He said he was flat on his face, actually right outside it, and stumbled in one morning and experienced his conversion and led him out of addiction and into a more life-giving place for himself. His story is powerful, and people are surprised to hear it because he is notable in his field. And so his story is one that's powerful, makes you sit up a little straighter and marvel at what God can do. But I remember after this service, I had a friend who said, gosh, if Mary Lynn, as our other pastor, has ever asked me to share my story, I don't know what I would have to say. Everybody's story is so dramatic. All I'd have to offer is that I had a troubled patch in my teenage years, and I came to faith, and that's the end of that story. And he was thinking it wasn't really so dramatic to share after hearing Rob's story. What struck me about his comment was that this particular guy, he did have a story of conversion, which I don't. I was a young child growing up in churches. He had a story of conversion from his teenage years, a real story, met somebody who changed his life in real ways, but still that story didn't feel like enough to share. I had a similar experience when I was going through the ordination process. You spend a lot of time in front of committees talking about your call to ministry. They'll always ask you, tell us about your sense of call. And you all know me to be a bit more of a cerebral person, and so I described my faith journey from the more fundamentalism I was raised in and moving toward more mainline progressive Protestant Christianity, my path from being a musician to feeling called to ministry and going to seminary. And it is a story that I should get down to the space of an elevator ride. I haven't quite gotten there yet. But I tell my genuine and heartfelt story, and I always got the sense that the committee found a little wanting. They were looking for that moment, that Pauline moment where bright lights appeared and I was called in a new way and my life needed to change, and I didn't have that. I had an evolution that I would tell them about at length as long as they wanted to listen. We know how to recognize transformation when it looks like Paul. These come to Jesus moments, a blinding light, a voice from heaven, a complete reversal. One day you're persecuting the church, and then the next day you're proclaiming Christ. And so in this post-Easter time when we're talking about becoming new and finding this new life we proclaim on Easter Sunday, this is what becoming new looks like. This is a path that we recognize. It's clear, it's dramatic, it's undeniable. And so we come to this story in Acts, and it's where our attention goes. It goes to Saul, who's soon to become Paul, and everything that happens to him. There is another person in this story, Ananias. And if we're honest, most of us in this room are not Paul, although some may be. But many of us, I think, relate more clearly to Ananias. He's a faithful guy. He's a faithful Jewish man. He's active in his synagogue. I assume he's a good husband and father, a pillar of the community. And now he's following Jesus in a sincere and genuine way. And to me, he sounds like a lot of us. We're here on a Sunday morning. We try to be faithful people. And if we aren't quite on that right path, we're honestly seeking it. That's why we're here. There may be a couple of Pauline stories out here, but I'm sure there are many of us who don't carry those kinds of experiences in our lives. And so here's a quiet assumption that we may carry, an assumption that's fed by a certain kind of preaching and some predispositions in our own culture. We love conversion stories. Sometimes the message of the church is that Christianity is for people who are broken, whose lives are falling apart. For people who are at a crisis point in their lives. We think that before faith, our lives are in trouble, that only the faithful have lives that are in some kind of order. And the message to many people becomes that you don't belong here. You don't belong in a church. You don't need it yet. That faith is for someone who needs a dramatic turnaround. That grace is for the before and after story. And if this is your life, if you're mostly okay, if you're trying to be faithful, if you show up, if you do your best, then we might start to wonder, what does it mean for me to become new? What is this transformation in a life that already feels fairly put together? What is this transformation that God has for me? If my life is fairly respectable, if I'm reasonably happy, what is new for me then? What, of course, we all know, and what I've discovered in 20 years of ministry, is that even in good and faithful lives, there are often places where people feel unfinished. Places we don't always talk about when somebody asks us how we are today. We have maybe that longing for a partner who hasn't come, a quiet struggle of infertility, a marriage that looks fine on the outside but is strained underneath, the exhaustion of searching for work. You're qualified and capable, but still no doors are opening. The grief we carry for one who we lost long after the funeral and long after the condolence cards stopped coming. We have not necessarily broken lives or ones that from the outside look broken, but lives with edges, lives with ache. We have questions that don't have easy answers. And I know that this is true because this is part of what it looks like to be human. Jesus' life carried struggle. So what does becoming new look like for us? For those of us with undramatic, run-of-the-mill, very human problems, sometimes they appear as inconveniences, requiring a shift of plans. Sometimes they appear as personal struggles that may not be all that dramatic as stories to tell, or maybe they're stories we'd rather not tell, but they are all consuming nonetheless. This might be where we find ourselves in Ananias. Ananias is already faithful. He's not lost. He's not searching. He's not on the wrong path. He's a disciple in Damascus, a part of the unfolding Jesus way, a steady presence in his community. We might imagine him as someone that people trust, someone who shows up. And then God speaks to him, Ananias. And Ananias, like those who have been called before him, like our prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel here, he says, "Here I am, Lord." But as soon as God tells him what to do, his tone changes a little bit. Go to Saul, is what he's told. And Ananias says, in so many words, "Lord, no." I have heard about this man, what he has done, what he is capable of. Ananias responds with fear, with self-protection, and yet God sends him anyway. And somehow Ananias goes. He walks into the house, into the presence of the man he has every reason to fear, the man that everyone has been talking about, the man who has been hunting for people like him. And for a moment, we don't know what he'll say. And then Ananias says, "Brother Saul." Brother. He calls Saul brother. In that one word, everything shifts. Not just who Saul is, but how Ananias sees him. The distance collapses, the categories fall away. The enemy becomes family. And maybe even more than that, Ananias discovers something he didn't know before, that God can do this, that a life can change, that a person can become new, and that he, Ananias, that he can be part of it. Ananias, I imagine, goes home afterward, but not quite the same. This is part of becoming new. This is one way of becoming new, of grace working in a life, of holy wonder creeping into everyday assumptions, of expanded horizons, of broader visions of humanity, and of God's presence within it. Maybe becoming new isn't always about starting over. Maybe sometimes it's about being stretched, about something in us expanding, about love growing, of hope overflowing the boundaries we have imposed, of wonder interrupting the daily life journey. Paul is transformed by a blinding light. Ananias is transformed by saying yes to a call that scared him. It was a hard yes, one that took courage and faithfulness. And for most of us, that's where the newness comes. We may have dramatic moments, but not usually every day. Easter happens every year, though. And Calvin teaches us that every Sunday is a mini Easter. That's a lot of newness to expect to have in our lives, to expect to experience. A mini resurrection every Sunday. And so perhaps a lesson here for us is that newness, resurrections, mini Easters, that they don't always come in a dramatic moment that changes everything, but in the moments where we say yes rather than staying safe, we open a door that we have kept closed. We allow hope in a place that we had given up on. We risk connection where we have been guarded, where something in us shifts just a little, and suddenly the world is larger and more connected than it was before. And we may discover a new way to see love and to be love within it. What if the most important change in this story is not only what happens to Paul, but what becomes possible in Ananias and what becomes possible in us? I think about that friend of mine, the one with not a very dramatic story, not one that's dramatic enough to share. And I wonder if we've been asking the wrong question. Not about whether or not my story is dramatic enough, but where is God asking me to say yes right now? Where are the places in my life that I've been holding back? What is the edge of fear or resignation or the quiet ache that I've given up on? What is a newness that maybe God is offering me that I've been hesitant to claim or to walk into? Because God is not only in the business of rescuing broken lives. God is in the business of continuing creation and recreation of all of us, of creation as a whole. So maybe this week we don't wait for the blinding light. Maybe we listen for that quiet place where God is asking us to say yes. For trust, for an opening to create a shift or a change, for an openness to experiencing wonder, an openness to make love visible. In our yes, we may discover that we are becoming new.